Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Astrology Today with Jeff Harman. I'm Ella, Jeff's assistant. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us on Mondays now. Jeff's going to touch on current events. He's also going to touch on the new moon that's coming up, a little bit about the eclipse, the upcoming eclipse. And then our topic for today is our deeper identity. Can astrology lead us there? I wonder. What do you think, Jeff? Let's get started.
All right. Thanks for that. Yeah. So, the news has been a buzz. A lot of people have been asking me about this Kate Middleton situation. Everybody thought she was missing, and there was all kinds of scandalous stuff going on about, the royals. I don't follow the royals a lot, but I can tell you that, that essentially she did come out. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that it wasn't her and that the mole didn't match and all these other things that they're saying. And of course, the voice was modulated and an AI might have done it. I can say this. I looked at her birth chart. And again, we don't have an exact birth time on her. But I will say this. She has K2, which is the moon south node in Nadi astrology, transiting both Saturn and Mars. Plain English, that's always a time I tell people, be more aware of your health. Because when K2 transits Saturn, it always doesn't bode well. It can really throw health off a little bit. And it also is transiting her Mars. So plain English, not easy when it transits both of those. You can get stuff in the blood off, and in Ayurvedic astrology, it can be a little bit of a problem. But I think from everything I can see, and I did get asked an interrogation on this, was it her? Is she, going to die? And I would say no. Right now, the interrogation looks like she's going to keep going, but she's got to watch it down the line according to what I saw. She could run into some problems. She'll probably go into remission. And then she could have some problems in the future. So, I'm sure she's got 1,000 doctors around her and they'll do whatever they can do. So anyways, that's kind of the answer on that one. I think it was her. Maybe she had makeup on. Maybe that's why the mole wasn't there. But the chart leans more in the direction it was probably her on the video. And I know there's been a lot of scandalous stuff surrounding this, and I don't want to get into that. But overall, I think that's where she's at. She's definitely in a little bit of a harder time. She's got to watch it, that it doesn't come back down the line. The other issue is that horrible attack that went on in Russia. And of course, there's a lot of things flying around about that it was ISIS, and that there's all kinds of theories behind that. And I don't want to get into that. But, just like we see all these horrible attacks at any country or any event, I think the greatest, in my opinion, cowardice is when you take weapons and you shoot innocent people. It's so horrible. I mean, it's bad enough when it happens in war, right? But when you just sit there and gun down innocent people like they do, I mean, it's demonic. There's no other words for it. And I don't care which side of the fence anyone's on or who did what. It's just, not a very good situation. A lot of people were killed there. And of course, this is, I think, taking it up to 100,000 feet and looking down at, okay, what does this really represent possibly? Well, we've been mentioning that, again, we've got this eclipse coming up here in April. And of course, that'll be April 8th. Okay, so I want to demonstrate something here. The eclipse that's happening, the full moon eclipse that happened on the 25th, was the precursor. Now, they call it an Appulse Eclipse. Now, what an Appulse means, it means two celestial bodies that approach very closely. We get Appulse eclipses all the time. We just happen to have the full moon Appulse eclipse happening before the big one, April 8th. What I've got here on the screen, you can actually see right here, see the full moon is always the sun and the moon opposite each other. So you can see it says here, the sun is on the IC. What does that mean? Where the sun is at midnight. Well, this eclipse happens on midnight, right? Just a little bit after midnight. If you're on the East Coast, it's, like 3 a.m. So it's actually happening. You can see right down here through the Dakotas, across Nebraska, the eastern portion of Colorado, and right on the border of Texas and New Mexico, shooting down here through Mexico. So that's where the full moon happens. Now, why they call it an Appulse, it's also called by some as a penumbra eclipse, which basically means that the moon will never fully darken. It's not like a total eclipse. And the reason why is because the declination of the sun and the moon are within 3 minutes. So if you happen to be in the kind of mid to western states here, you will see a slight darkening of the moon. Now, that's the astronomy of it all. Now, this will be a cycle of the eclipse that will happen on April 8th. Now, here, we'll get into this much more in the next podcast, but you can actually see this is the ground zero eclipse point. Like if you are anywhere across these areas where I'm tracing here, you're going to see a total eclipse of the sun on April 8th. Well, this full moon that just happened here on Sunday night is an applause or precursor to that, known as Saros Cycles 8 North. This is a very powerful series. So we're in the shadow here, you could say, zone of this next 2 weeks leading up to this big eclipse point, which we'll talk more about next podcast. But at least this gives you an idea of the mechanics of what's going on. Now, that eclipse is a real wild card. Not only in Vedic astrology is it happening with the conjunction next to Rahu, which always tends to expand things and people's internal perception of reality. I always say Rahu is the movie we're all playing. Ketu is the liberation from the karma in Nadi astrology. So that's the moon south node. And remember, eclipses only happen when the sun and the moon and the earth align. And eclipses are very mysterious. Why? Because the sun might be the portal to the upper divinities of heaven. And it's like the seed of creation. The moon is the crucible. Well, when they cross eclipse points, what happens? We get a darkening of that, right? So very interesting. There's a kind of a strange, weird perception of reality that mixes on those eclipses. And each one is different. Now, I don't want to get into all the eclipses today because we're going to save that for the future podcast coming up next week. We're going to really focus on that. But I will mention this. This eclipse is exceedingly dynamic. Why? See, they start at the north and south poles. All these eclipses do. The Chaldeans, the ancient Greeks and Brahmins in India, they knew that these eclipses weren't just random eclipses of the sun and the moon and earth aligning, but they were actually started at the north and south pole. And then it serpentines around the earth. And this one just happens to be dropping right here, April 8th of 2024. And it happens to be striping right across the central United States up, across the Atlantic. So very, very powerful. If you're centered on that, you're going to see it full. If you're away, 200-300 miles, is going to be like down to 75%. People in Europe won't see it, you see, because it'll be happening when it happens right over the United States. So there's all kinds of conspiracy theory. I know people are renting properties and lawn chairs and everything else like everybody does in glasses to see the eclipse. But the deeper meanings of the eclipses are you look at the energies that happened when they started at the North or South Pole. This one actually began at the North Pole, and it actually began in 1501. That's a long time ago. Now, people say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, see, eclipses begin either at the poles, and then they serpentine around. You see, this eclipse series will actually end in 2700, like 2745 or something like that. We'll get all these details later. What does it mean? This eclipse has a very innovative dynamic energy, but it's also happening, remember, in the background of the world stage. Plus, we have a Pluto return going on in the United States. The United States is under duress. Do we need me or any astrology to know that? I mean, just look around. The whole crazy country. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, it's a dumpster fire. No. The whole country's on fire, metaphorically, and it really is. You got the border being crashed through. You got dystopia in all of the crime that's going on and people letting everyone free. You've got all this $1.2 trillion budget that just passed and nothing in there about the border. I mean, we have pictures of people stampeding the border. And, the National Guard can only stand there and point rifles at the sky. It's like, really? they're actually told to stand down. And there's so many people upset in different branches of government. I actually have clients who are in politics and are just livid right now about what's going on. And guess what? They can't do anything because they're handcuffed. The only guy who really can is the the president in the White House who's doing nothing. He's actually promoting it. And that's because his handlers, the owners at the top of the pyramid, are out to destroy the country. So the bottom line is we're in a really dangerous place, and this eclipse is going to come through and exacerbate a lot of things. The eclipse itself is actually really dynamic. What's going to go on is Mars and Saturn, we'll get into this next week, is actually going to cross the eclipse point at the end of April into May. That's when I think the fireworks are really going to start. And also, we've got a lot of tension building. And this thing in Russia and the stuff that's going on in Ukraine and all the funding and the border and the stuff going on in Israel and the Middle East. Now this is going to bring Iran into it with ISIS and all that. So it's a real quagmire. So we're seeing the energy stack up, and we could see a lot of trouble again this summer. And of course, we see the presidential stuff that's going on with Trump and Biden and everything else.
If Putin attacks a NATO ally, we will defend every inch of NATO which the treaty requires and calls for.
Hey, Mr. Grumpy Gills. When life gets you down, you know what you gotta do?
I don't want to know what you gotta do.
Just keep swimming, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, swimming, swimming. What do? We
Pretty crazy. So we got the picture show continues. It never stops, folks, until the fat or skinny lady sings, right?
Or somebody.
Yeah, or somebody, right? I don't know if I'll get anybody.
Man, could be anybody.
Yeah. Right.
Pretty wild. Of course, it's not only this country that's on fire, it's the entire world. I wake up in the morning and I just can't believe it. I say to myself, this is such a beautiful place. The earth itself is so glorious and so gorgeous. How can us as human beings have created all of this chaos? And I mean, it's just unbelievable. But you nailed it. It's the demonics, right? It's the demonics that come in.
It really is. It's part of this dimension. You know, they actually say there's like 300 and something planets in the ancient Aramaic and Hebrew documents. I believe the Vedantic says that too in the Rig Veda. There's many planets like this one. Some are at different points of evolution. And of course, this one, I always call it the soul cauldron. You know, and when we talk about time, I always say, I think God created time so everything wouldn't happen at once, right? And if you look at time itself, yes, in these bodies and in our lives, we've got our monthly bills, we have our, age, our biologics, everything. Clearly, there's time. But if you took away sunrise, noon, sunset, midnight, and the cycles of the sun, or I should say the earth around the sun, and the cycles of the moon, would there really be time? And when you really get into spirit and disincarnate souls, there's so many reports by many really intelligent doctors and regressionary therapists and psychologists who've regressed people. There's no time. There's no time. I actually heard a wonderful thing. There's a book called Freeing the Captives by a medical doctor, Dr. Louise Allen Fry, and she was regressing a patient and found a little boy trapped in the aura. And she said, "Where are you from?" And he started reciting all this stuff about the era that he was born in. And she extrapolated it back that he was probably born in the 1400s. He had been trapped in the astral worlds, possessing people for over 400 and something years, almost 500 years, actually. And at the time she did a regression. So amazing stuff. And again, there's no time. There's only perception and, of course, our experience through these lifetimes. But anyways, where we're at right now, again, I've been saying the Pluto return in the United States, and we have entered an exceedingly high-tech era ever since the winter solstice of 2020. Liken it to what happened in the 17 and 1800s when we began the Industrial Revolution. The difference is now we're standing on the shoulders of all the Industrial Revolution's fruits. So we are rocketing forward in technology and an acceleration. And of course, this is why we hear AI. You never heard AI before 2020. You never heard it. The people talked a little bit about it, 2001 and Space Odyssey, but now as AI, they just never stop. And it's really funny because we're in a different world. And I think this is a topic I've talked to a lot of clients about where, they talk about their children, or we talk about our reality systems are really shifted. And I believe the handlers at the top of the pyramid were very well aware of this, and they knew about 220, and they knew about this change in evolution because they were prepared for it. We look at, how they came into it with all the suppression of information, et cetera. It's still going on right now. So it's like 1984 on steroids. But we're going to see where this happens after this election year here in the United States. And we see this mysterious push to fund everything in different areas. And of course, the United States is just handing out money like crazy, except we could have rebuilt every bridge and road in our country for what we have stuck into some of these foreign wars. So pretty intense.
So intense. Well, tell us a little bit about the full moon that's coming up.
Thank you. We also have a full moon that actually, as this broadcast comes out, it has just happened. It happened actually on the late night of the 24th, depending on where you're at. It's right at about midnight on the West Coast on the 24th, which is, again, Sunday night. Or if you're on the East Coast, it would have happened right at about 2:59 a.m. or something like, or 3 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States. So, and if, again, you're anywhere else in the world, extrapolate. This full moon always brings things to a crescendo. In the sidereal zodiac, it actually was, the sun is in Pisces and the moon is over in Virgo. So it's very, very powerful. They're opposite one another. And again, Virgo's earth, Pisces is water. So this is a powerful full moon. And in some ways, you could say it's a bit revealing. And I think it's emotionally setting up a lot of things for this eclipse coming in. We're also in the shadow of Mercury, about to go retrograde. When? On April 1st. We'll be talking a lot about that next podcast too. So
yeah, and we've got a pretty powerful energy coming up on the 13th as well, don't we? Or is it? No, is it the 13th?
Well, it's the 12th.
It's the 12th.
It'll be the 12th of April. That's the Mars-Saturn conjunction, right? That's a big one in April. We're going to talk a lot more about that next week. Yep.
Yeah. So getting on to our topic, our deeper identity.
Yeah. And that's a great topic, because can our deeper identity be shown by astrology? For a lot of people who aren't familiar with my channel, and if you're just coming in or if you've been listening, I don't just do one type of astrology. I got into astrology back in the mid-70s. My mother was pegging my girlfriends to the T, the different ones I would go on with. And I just went, wait a minute. I said, this isn't mother's intuition. And what are you doing here? And she started showing me. And we were kind of fledgling at that time, but she was pretty good. But it was all done by hand. She did charts by hand. And what's interesting is I was surprised at how she could actually pick up the identity or personality traits. Like she would say, oh, this one's this way, or that person's this way. And this is what really intrigued me about astrology. In the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, I had a recording studio and I was doing a lot of really cool stuff. I was doing all kinds of religious things. I was doing recordings like radio shows. I actually worked with Mother Teresa, all kinds of different people. And I was doing radio shows, but I was also doing albums for churches. I was doing rock bands. I was doing punk bands, almost everything you can think of. Commercials, did a ton of commercials. Also did a lot of electronical and acoustic design and forensics work, and a lot of industrial films for a lot of big companies. It was a lot of fun, and music videos. and had a lot of fun doing that. And here's why I mention this is because I would always be doing astrology in the background when I could. I would always look at someone's birth chart whenever I could get it. And I would examine the uniqueness of all of us. I mean, this is where sun sign astrology really truly is love, light, and cluelessness. Why you clearly can see certain basic traits in the sun sign, but in Vedic or Nadi astrology, see, a lot of people wonder, about what is Vedic astrology. Vedic astrology is kind of a pop term. And as I'd mentioned, Chakrapani might be the guy who coined that phrase. That was way back in the 70s. He said, Americans are not going to know what Jyotisha means, so we'll call it Vedic astrology. He might have been the guy who gets credit for that. At least I give him credit for it, and a lot of other people do. So the bottom line was, Chakrapani passed away not too long ago. He was really a sweet guy. I really liked him. And Jyotisha means the science of the light of the soul. Now, think about that one. If you really want to look at, can it show us who we are? Or can, we see our identity in that? That's exactly what Vedic astrology looks at. So instead of the Western world saying, oh, you're a Pisces or an Aries, it's looking at, this was the time at which the angels tied us into the body. And I have to give credit here to the ancient rabbinical astrologers as well. The ones out of Chaldea, the ones out of Egypt, the ones out of Mesopotamia, which of course we now call Iraq, the cradles of Western civilization, which then matriculated up to the medieval times. And I've got a lot of these documents. There's been some wonderful translations that have been pouring out over the last 30, 40 years that are stunning. Actually, the last 50 years. And what it really shows is that, again, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. So the astrology, instead of being us, the astrology might be us. Rather than we are the astrology is us. So now the question is can it show our identity? I think it shows
a deeper identity.
A deeper identity.
Our deeper identity, right? Not what's on the surface. And I think this topic is so deep because we are trying to get to our deeper identity, not just what we see on the surface and not what's, on automatic every day.
That's right. And I'm so glad you cut in there because let me tell you why. I always say tropical astrology is where the rubber hits the road. It is the more outer surface. And a lot of people have come to the conclusion today that tropical astrology isn't accurate because it isn't exactly where the sun and the constellations are in the sky as the sidereal. Well, I would tend to disagree with that because I think it's the outer layer. And the deeper inner layer identity is the Vedic astrology, is the path of the soul, or to really want to go down the rabbit hole, Nadi astrology. Nadi astrology is really cool. There's actually a doctor that I'm really good friends with. He's over in India. And there's these old people that have been living their lives in grass huts. I mean, they go to the bathroom in a little hole in the ground. This is the kind of poverty we're talking about in these old southern Indian villages. And they have the Nadi palm leaves. And they can line up all the different things about the events in your life. And what's interesting, my first exposure to Nadi astrology was a long time ago, late 80s. And I went, wow, this is really cool. Actually, it was in the early 90s. And what's so fascinating is how different it is even from what modern Vedic astrologers call Vedic astrology. Not that that isn't accurate too, but the Nadi looks at it through a completely different lens. See, all of a sudden now, the sun is your father, the moon is your mother. Siblings are either Venus for sisters or the moon, and it changes, or Mars for the brother. And it can also equal Mercury for other brothers. So there's all these signifactors. So now all of a sudden you're looking at a matrix of the astrology where the planetary significations become people and events in your life. You see? So for a woman, Mars becomes a signifactor for a marriage partner. For a man, Venus is a signifactor for the woman, for the wife, you see? So very, very interesting stuff. And here's what's so fascinating. In Nadi astrology, they progress it's totally different than Western astrology. There's actually progressions of Jupiter, Saturn, and the nodes, Rahu and Ketu, the eclipse points. And let me tell you, it's so accurate, it's creepy. I watched one old guy, his name was Priya. He used to sit there and go, oh, this person will do this here, they'll do that here, go to college, get married, do this, do that, have this amount of children or no children, and they'll probably die right about here. And I went, wow. And I would test him, and it's really amazing. And I use it every day in readings because it adds so much depth to the identity of who we are. And I think that deeper identity really comes down to the soul. You know, religions, for the most part in the West, hate astrology, right? It's a work of the devil, right? Well, it's actually the work of God and the angels on your soul. And when you look at Nadi astrology and Jyotisha, which is really the science of the light of the soul, it's totally from that perspective. And then you say, well, where is the soul? Well, the soul is the God force energy that might be pouring through the matrix of the planets for the experiential sequences in what we call time. See, they say in the ancient Hebraic documents that everything under the sun and everything under the moon particularly will be born, it will grow, it will mature, it will atrophy, and it will die. And everything will go through that. And no matter whether you're in the human kingdom, the animal kingdom, the mineral kingdom, or the plant kingdom. The mineral should have been last, but the plant or mineral kingdom. So, and that's true. Look at the earth. Even we see the erosion and the changes, and we go back through history, and the geologists will tell you, man, everything has changed, right? The continents split. So what is time and all this stuff? It's really just a human experience. Not that time on earth isn't real. It certainly is. It's definitely a physical phenomena, but only on the reality machine of earth. And the astrology seems to modulate this magical experience we call life. You know, many people experience life on ebbs and flows. You know, you talk to people, we all have good times. We all have challenging times. We all have cycles where we go through things, right? I don't care if it's a pet or a loved one.
It's inevitable when you buy the pet. You're supposed to know it in the pet shop. It's going to end badly.
And it's really mysterious how accurate this stuff is. And I think not only does it show our identity, but it shows those ebbs and flows that go on that actually shape our perception of reality. Because really, the lower conscious mind, which we refer to as our identity in these lifetimes, is actually truly not us. We form these when we're blocked, when we're spanked on the rear end in the delivery room or whatever else they did to us. So the bottom line is our lower conscious personality starts forming there. But what's interesting, like the other night, I just rectified a gentleman who was found in Iran outside of an orphanage. Mother just left him there. And they did a bone density test on him and said, well, you had to be born about 3 months before this time that we, discovered you. So they extrapolated his birth time. And I use an intuitive method combined with what we call rectification. That's asking questions at what time or day you were born. And if it doesn't line up with the chart, you probably don't have the right chart. And so I actually found out he was born maybe 5 days before what they saw, but that's pretty close, when you use science and bone density stuff and you don't even know what month you were born. So, and we kept poking around and figured out what time he was born. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because people really come here in all different conditions. Some of us are born with silver spoons, right? Print the date on the silver spoon. I actually had one friend, his dad actually printed his birth date on the silver spoon. Of course, he was a banker, right? So anyways, and then others of us are left outside. I've done a lot of rectifications on people, particularly who come from Korea and some of the Southeast Asian places where the mother has an unwanted pregnancy and just leaves them, in a train station or at a police station or something. And that's what happened to this individual. He was actually found outside of an orphanage by a police officer. And the police officer brought him and saved his life, So there's another reason. Cops aren't always bad, right? So they help people. So the bottom line was, he was looking at who his identity is. And that's one of the things I always try and focus on in readings is not just astrology, but extracting out of that birth chart, who is this soul and where is this soul going in this journey we call life? And I think that's the really, important question to ask us all. Who are we? Who are we? And the astrology can reflect amazing stuff by the positions of the planets. And especially in the Nadi astrology, you can see they're called indicators, called karakas. It's a fancy word that just means indicators. And you can actually see, and they claim that the angel, the guardian angel, waits until the right celestial arrangement. And when we exit mom's womb and we commence our first breath, that's when the celestial perception of time starts. And then we form our worldly identity. And what's fascinating about psychology is the older we get, not all of us, but a lot of us, become aware that this reality is not us. It's an experience. The lower conscious mind is the steering wheel, the gas pedal, and the brakes, or if you like, the keyboard, screen, and the mouse in modern terminology, right? Or your iPhone, right? Or a Droid. But it's really an interface to this magical world of the five senses and our six-space reality. And this is what's talked about in the ancient text called the Sefer Yetzirah, which means the book of formation, where spirit begins to condense or collate into matter. And this is where the celestial influences of the soul interblend into the molecular worlds. And of course, when you look at an embryo and you look at the sperm joining, I don't care if it's an animal, human, or whatever, or a seed in the ground, talk about magic. That's divine magic. When you see life not only sprout in an embryo, but then it's attached with spirit, psyche, and soul. And then the genetics that unfold. Any of you listening who've had a child, I don't care what gender, they're amazing. It's magical. Look at a little puppy or a little animal or a plant grow. You figure that out in a lab, you let me know. Now, splicing genes and cloning is not creating life, and it certainly isn't ensouling it. And the astrology is an interactive consciousness that interacts with it. And that's what's so cool. I'll be lucky if I live 3 lifetimes to fully understand the magic that is inflected into the soul in the various astrological, you could say, infusions. They literally say the planets are called graha, which means seizer or grasper of the aura, and that when a dosha, a progression, or a transit, these are all things astrologers use that make your eyeballs cross in terms of complexity. But once you understand it, these are time divisions in what we call time when we're in these bodies. And the magic of it is that it's releasement of spirit and angelic forces that shape the soul. Even some of the bad stuff has good, you could say, shapings of the soul. Like we see some people go through really challenging experiences. That could be the dissipation of karmas, or something had to happen to wake that soul up. So it's a totally different perspective when you look at Nadi astrology and the ancient types of astrology, because I use not only quote unquote Vedic or Jyotisha, but Nadi blended with ancient traditional astrology, which is really the stuff that came up out of Chaldea, Egypt, Mesopotamia, all the way up into the medieval times. So it's really cool stuff. And it looks at astrology so much differently, which can help reveal our inner self and identity. And that's the goal, is to come away with, who are we? The angel on the eastern horizon is amazing. I am blown away by that. Every single person I've ever looked at, and I know if I got the birth time right, we had a time machine and we went back to the day you were born and shot a laser off the earth at the longitude, latitude of the minute and second you were born into the sidereal zodiac, you get an angel. And I always know when the birth chart's right, because the identity of that angel influences the entire life. It's amazing. And I've seen, like, Donald Trump. I know everybody hates Trump, right? And everybody loves Trump. But he was actually born with a crown on a king's throne. So no matter whether you like Trump or hate Trump, he has that energy. Look at all the gold around the Trump Towers, even though they're killing him right now. But isn't this interesting? I just brought him up for one example. We could look at Kate Middleton's if we had the right. You can look at anyone. That's one of the things I do in a reading is look at your angel on the eastern horizon in the sidereal zodiac. Why? The eastern horizon is where spirit manifests. And think about that. When we come out of mom's womb, literally at that first breath, they say that's when spirit is finally permanently tied into the body at first breath. And that's longitude, latitude, and exact position of the eastern horizon, no matter where you were born on the earth, is the point where spirit manifests. So you talk about magic, that's divine magic. So here's something else I wanted to talk about with respect to that divine magic. These are pendants that I actually calculate the guardian angel of the person's birth chart onto pendants. And if you look at each one of these pendants, you'll see there's 7 letters. These equal the 7 inner planets for each birth chart. And they're weighted in sidereal and zodiacal dignity. In other words, the inner 7 planets are weighted from the ascendant. That's why the ascendant was where spirit manifests. See, in Vedic astrology, they call it the Lagna. Lagna actually means that. It means where spirit gathers or where it enters. So each of these pendants you can see here as I'm circling, those are the inner 7 planets. If you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that's followed by Aleph Lamed. Now, what does that mean? All angels of God end in L. You can actually do this in Sanskrit and Tamil, but the interesting thing is all languages are sacred. And what's interesting about the Aramaic and Hebrew is you can actually get the codes in Gematria and Notricon that can match the ancient verses in cryptology in the Bible, which many Westerners call the Old Testament, but it's actually known as the Torah, which is all about creation. But the way that I uses the ascendant as where spirit manifests. And this is quite fascinating because I give people not only the pendant with their guardian angel, but a whole printout on vellum of what it means in the numerology and the correspondences to the Psalms and the Old Testament. This is stuff that's been lost in the Vulgate translations and many other translations. So fun stuff. You can actually see these are all different designs. I've done many of these over the years, and people really enjoy them. And I believe it really imbues an energy. Each one of these gems were also set at a very specific astrological time, not only to the planet ruling the gem, but also the person's birth chart. So you never set a gem when it's your 6th, 8th, or 12th house. And ideally, you want to have the aspects in the birth chart match the mundane aspects in the sky. This was the ancient systems of planetary gemology that the kings and the queens and the pharaohs had used throughout time immemorial. Further, there's a whole method of cleansing these and charging these with spring water, incense, and also through above fire, and then you place it on what we call an angelic square known as a yantra. And that imbues the divine energy into these gemstones.
Divine magic, divine magic. This makes me, listening to you, having this topic today, makes me think about everything comes from the source, right? Everything stems from the source. And ultimately, I mean, that source to me has got to be the ultimate, which is love, of course. So that's got to be the deeper identity. It also makes me think about, when my mom was passing, and for 3 days up until that point, all she talked about was love. That's all she talked about, and it was interesting. It was the same for my sister. That's all they, talked about was love. And you can feel it. That's our deeper identity, truly, is the connection with the source, which is what we all come from, right? And that's got to be love.
Yeah, well, you bet. And I mean, it's a blessing when people have that connection when they're getting ready to pass, but there's a lot of people who don't. I see people look at the violence that we see going on in the earth. And a lot of these souls get taken out like that. Wars or some atrocious thing or a murder. And, what's fascinating about this, you can actually see that in the chart sometimes. And I don't like to get into that, but you can also look at the Lord of the Eighth and see the likelihood of what type of death. You can even see in the previous incarnation how they were likely brought here. See, and this is very mysterious, talking about eclipse points. The nodes are the portals. See, the node, Shakespeare was right. The whole world's a stage and we're the actors. So the north node is always the worldly perception of reality. And the south node, K2, the south node eclipse point, is the escape from Alcatraz, moksha, liberation. And it's always a blessing when people are getting ready to go, that they're in a peaceful, more, open state. A lot of people aren't. And that's why I call this the soul cauldron. And you literally have every possible reality going on here. Talk about the matrix. I always say, forget Trinity, Neo, and Morpheus. This is really the matrix of the soul here. And uncountless souls. I mean, you can't even count them. Billions upon billions of souls have waved through this planet. And God only knows for how long. If we go around the central sun every about 25,700 to 900 years, no one's sure, but it's just short of 26,000 years, called the Great Year, recession of the equinoxes. How many souls could you get to pass through when the average lifespan is somewhere between 70 and 100 years? Now, I do think we live longer at certain periods of the yugas. We had an interesting video about that before where we touched upon that very complex topic of the yugas.
Oh, interesting, Jeff. This is such an interesting topic. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us on Mondays. Have a great week ahead. We'll see you next time on Astrology Today with Jeff Harman.